Well, good evening, and thank you for coming tonight. My name's Jeremy Jackson. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Public Choice and Private Enterprise. We're hosting tonight's event along with the City Institute for Growth and Innovation. We have a number of announcements that I'd like to make before we get started with the program, and we'll kick those off. First thing, you may recall that we've been doing a lot of events under the theme of Mansur-Olson as of late. We have another event that's going to be coming up in November. There's actually going to be an art show in the Flackel Gallery that highlights works of art that are inspired by the ideas of Mansur-Olson. So we invite you to come out to that on Thursday, November 7th. There will be an opening reception. Also, we have our Mansur-Olson Scholar program. Our Mansur-Olson Scholars are a reading group. Students get together having read books and discuss the readings. Applications are open right now, so if you're interested, we would love to have you apply. The application deadline is November 27th. Students that participate do get a scholarship for participating. We have two topics. First, the topic will be actually reading novels, so not actually reading anything that's really economics, but reading novels and looking at how literature reflects and affects society and other questions of human flourishing. We'll also have a discussion group focusing on freedom and foreign policy. So those two groups are being formed and they're open for applications right now. If you don't like our Facebook page, actually the Facebook page has links to all of these, so if you like it, then you'll get to see the links for these applications. They're also on the Public Choice and Private Enterprise website. We also have a new program that's the Mansur-Olson Fellows Program. This is a program designed to help you develop skills in policy research. So if you have an interest in being involved in policy, whether you just are actually a very beginning student or you're a senior student, we're hoping to get students engaged at all levels, and we'll work with you to develop skills. And again, this is an experience that will come with a stipend of some form as well. We're taking applications for that, and again, those applications are available on our website. For tonight, after we're done with the event, before we leave, there will be, of course, question and answer time from the audience. We'll have the mic in a box that we'll throw around for those of you who have a question, but you can also, if you don't feel like using the mic, if you send a question on Twitter to #CapitalismAndSociety, we'll ask the question for you. So please use that. Also, for students who are here hoping to get some extra credit, be sure that you fill out the extra credit form and then return it at the end when you leave. We do have pizza and pop for us to have after the event's over as well. For the programs that I mentioned as well, if you're interested, there's cards with more information about all of the Mansur-Olson programs that we have. And so as you're leaving, feel free to take some of those information cards with you. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce tonight's speaker. So our speaker tonight is Joshua Hall. He's a professor of economics and chair of the Department of Economics and director of the Center for Free Enterprise, all in the John Chambers College of Business and Economics at West Virginia University. He is also editor of the Journal of Regional Analysis and Policy and the Journal of Entrepreneurship and Public Policy. He earned his bachelor and master degree in economics from Ohio University and his PhD from West Virginia University in 2007. He is a past president of the Association of Private Enterprise Education and is also a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute. He's also a co-author of the widely cited Economic Freedom of the World annual report, and he's the author and co-author of over 100 journal articles. Dr. Hull is actually one of the most prolific writers that I know. He publishes in a way that I would love to. He actually has a book that he edited that goes by the title Homer Economicus, The Simpsons and Economics. This is one of the books that our reading group has been reading this semester. So with that, I welcome Josh up to the stage, and please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been kind of following what both the Tully Center and Dr. Jackson's group has been doing from afar, and so it's delighted to be here and see lovely Fargo. So I am known kind of for the Economic Freedom of the World Index. That's mostly what I typically talk about in these types of things, but I'm going to focus on a new line of work that takes me back to my original interests. I'm from Ohio originally, and we were talking, some of us, I can't remember if it was a group of students or some of the faculty today, about how our upbringing kind of drives our interest. And if anybody is here from Ohio or knows anything about Ohio, Ohio has a long history of local government. Okay, Ohio has 612 school districts. It has thousands of cities, 88 counties. And maybe that causes me to want to study what are the benefits, what are the costs of this type of jurisdictional fragmentation. And so this talk kind of comes out of some recent work I've done, along with some of our grad students at West Virginia University. Hey, just give you a quick overview. I'm very, to be respectful of your time, I'm going to go fast. Normally I would say, hey, ask me questions, but it seems like we have that covered with the catch box. And so I want to make sure we leave enough time for Q&A. I'm going to kind of give you some overview, talk a little bit about the theory and the methods kind of we use to try to get this, and basically show you some case studies of some consolidations. And what I think is unique about what we've learned in these cases is why some consolidations work and why some fail. And I think they point to some of the issues that some of the Manson-Olson reading groups have looked at in the past. Okay, if you don't know this, the United States has tons of local governments. If we think about counties, municipalities, you guys have townships. Not every place has townships. I'm 7 miles from the Pennsylvania border. Pennsylvania has over 1,000 townships. You have water districts. You have school districts. Okay, in every single category, I think maybe except for water districts, the number of local governments is shrinking over time. And the number of individuals serviced by many of these local governments, not in all cases, is growing. So this could be a good thing if we think there's, like what economists think of, are economies of scale in the production of these goods. So getting bigger water districts or bigger school districts. In the 60s, this was a huge thing. The president of Harvard, James Bryan Conant, thought to win the Cold War, we need larger school districts, larger high schools, because we need to have every high school have calculus, because that math and science is how we're going to beat the Soviets. And I want to ask the question, is this consolidation, this is the thing, is this consolidation good? Is it bad? By what criteria? So there's been waves of consolidation. It goes basically back to the progressive era, this kind of scientific rationalization of this doesn't seem to be the best way to do this. And I understand that. I mean, I think that every economist has a bit of an engineer in them, and they think like this doesn't seem like the most efficient way to do things. I mean, if I think about Morgantown, West Virginia, where I live, we have lots of little cities. You don't know where one ends and one begins. One side of the street has fire service. The next side of the street's in the county and doesn't have fire service. The other side of the street is back in the city, and it does have fire service. And so it can be very confusing. Okay? But we got to remind that it's budgetary pressures. There's kind of this naive view that, look, to use Ohio's example, 612 school districts. Do we need all those school districts, all with superintendents making $150,000 or more? If we consolidate, we've saved $150,000. But a very simple principle from the economist Deirdre McCloskey is eliminating the position doesn't eliminate its function. The superintendent of a 1,000-person school district is very different than the superintendent of the Cleveland Public Schools, which has 60,000 students. They have much more, for example, administrators, because there's still work that has to be done. Okay, so basically the arguments in favor of consolidation focus on three main ideas. It's more efficient, meaning we get the same output for less dollars spent. It's more equitable to consolidate. You don't have the haves and have-nots. And it's also good for economic development. I think there's really two. It's equity and economic development, because if you're being efficient with your dollars, people are going to want to move there. We see this with people moving to low-tax states that have relatively high government services. And so you're going to get the movement of people and capital to places that are efficient, where government's efficient, and moving away from places where they seem to be wasting tax dollars. So I'm really going to focus on this economic development argument, although I will touch on the equity part of it. And then at the end, I'm just going to show you some interesting work using what economists call the synthetic control method, just to say, like, well, how do we really know that these are the effects of these consolidations? Okay, so people who are in favor, I would say proponents of local government consolidation, they typically give three reasons. One is this social stratification that happens when people kind of vote with their feet and have the opportunity to select into small areas. I'm sure you have these areas here. Might be a little enclave of either high-performing schools or an area that has kind of low taxes but relatively high government services, maybe because it doesn't have a high demand for those government services. Okay? This political fragmentation will sometimes argued lead to a race to the bottom. Governments don't provide a lot of redistribution because people who are against that redistribution vote with their feet and move out. So we get too little redistribution. And then finally, another equity concern is that minority voices get subsumed in the majority if we're under greater fragmentation. So these kind of arguments have been countered by lots of people. The Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom, for example, points out that, well, we have many different layers of government, and some layers of government are better able to do certain jobs than others. And the federal government and state governments are really where redistribution should happen. That really shouldn't be a local concern. One way we see this in policy is at the state level, many states have, for example, state equalization formulas to try to equalize spending across school districts. And just as consolidation could theoretically lead to more equitable distribution, often in practice, it just masks by aggregating up to some higher level, right? So you have all these cities and townships consolidated into one county government, and it looks like spending is equal, but really what's happening is the individuals who would always have the spending, they still get spent on those areas. So Cobb County, for example, in Atlanta, funds a new baseball stadium at the same time cutting services to libraries. And then finally, this argument that consolidation can give minority voices larger say. Really, this depends on the context, right? Certainly, you could have a small minority-majority area that gets consolidated into a larger majority area, and the minority voice be diluted. One of the case studies I'm going to talk about, Louisiana Lafayette Parish, is exactly that. A predominantly African-American area gets consolidated into a larger, more homogeneous county, and those minority voices get diluted. So ultimately, it seems to be kind of an empirical issue or at what level do you think government should do something like redistribute? Okay. On the efficiency side, this really seems to be the place that most people make arguments for government consolidation. Right? If I talk to my parents, this is the thing they're going to argue on. Right? Hey, if we have all these governments, how are we going to get that new, my parents are from Cleveland, how are we going to get that new Cleveland Browns stadium? Right? You need a large government to have comprehensive planning, the story goes. And we get rid of that wasteful competition where every single area says, hey, me too. We reduce kind of sprawl. On the business side, it reduces regulatory complexity. We don't have all these jurisdictions, each with its own rules. Right? Businesses know, well, if I locate here, I have the same set of rules. I go anywhere in the state or the municipal area. And then finally, consolidation allows for big regional development projects. We can think of something like a new highway or levee improvements. Why might that be a bad idea? Because that all seems like a good thing. It seems sensible. I can look at areas like, we have anybody from St. Louis. St. Louis is one of the most fragmented cities you will ever see. It has something like 150 jurisdictions just in the greater St. Louis MSA. Some as small as 13 people live in one of the jurisdictions. But what are some of the benefits of fragmentation? Well, one is you do get some sort of competition. When we go to the store, we think about value because hey, this is a price, and I know over there they sell this exact same good and it's a little bit cheaper. And it really depends on how much time it costs me to walk over there to do it. I can comparison shop. Well, if we have no other jurisdictions in the city, how do we comparison shop, right? If you're in Miami-Dade County has one school district. 3 million people, one school district. How do you know if you're getting a lot of value? Well, you have a sense whether your kids are doing well, but what if you're just a regular taxpayer? If you're in Boston, in the same geographic area as Miami-Dade County, you have 80 school districts. That's a lot of opportunity to compare and see, hey, am I getting good value for my tax dollars? I can vote with my feet. And so this competitive pressure gives incentive for governments to try to please the taxpayer. You can think of it as a monopoly problem. Okay? And then this kind of competition, it doesn't necessarily lead to a race to the bottom. I lived in, again, Ohio has lots. I lived in the highest tax district in Ohio. And we also were a very high service district. And why was I happy with this? Because I got high services. I got what I wanted. The key question is, do taxpayers, do citizens get what they want out of their local government? So what I'm not talking about in this talk is small-scale consolidation. Okay, so you might have something like a rural fire department realize that it can't meet its needs and consolidate with a nearby department. That's less controversial. That's a bargaining. That's happening based on some sort of need. What I'm talking about is this thing. Well, hey, we have this St. Louis county. We need to consolidate every government within that into a large county government. Or in my home state of West Virginia, they want to consolidate every government in a 3-county area into one mega county. That's what this particular talk is kind of pushing back against. Okay? And this idea of city, so what I mean by city is every entity within that in that county being consolidated up into the county government. And ultimately, I think this is an empirical question. So what do the empirics say? So it goes back to about 1997. All of these studies tend to look at just one city. So they'll look at, for example, Jacksonville, Duval County, Florida, and they'll look before what was going on with economic development, what happened afterwards, or Lexington, Kentucky, or Indianapolis, Indiana, which is a very famous consolidation. This literature largely finds zero effect, and some find negative. Very few find a positive. Very few empirical papers find a positive. You can find a positive on other measures, such as consumer satisfaction of particular services, but what you don't find is economic development benefits. I think this is problematic from a social science perspective, because if all we're doing is comparing before and after in the same city, we have an issue because cities that consolidate are fundamentally different than cities that don't consolidate. In fact, cities that want to consolidate often have what are called a crisis moment. They want to consolidate because things are not going well. People are moving out of the area. You see an erosion of the tax base, and therefore they want to expand the area. Hey, people are moving out of the city into the unincorporated county. Let's bring them all under the same heading and get that tax base back, right? And so that crisis mentality means that places that consolidate are fundamentally different than areas that don't consolidate. Okay? So it's kind of like the equivalent of saying chemotherapy leads to all sorts of bad outcomes without taking into account that the people getting chemotherapy actually had cancer. So my co-authors and I said we can do better at this, and we can use this thing called the synthetic control method. I'm not going to get in the weeds on this. You don't need to know. It's a very simple idea of what this is. The real problem we have as any sort of social scientist is what is the counterfactual? We're not like laboratory science. Everybody understands, like, hey, if we're testing a drug, we take a large group of people, we give some people the actual drug, we give some people a sugar pill. We follow them, and we test what happens. So I guess if we had another world, kind of like Superman, where there's Bizarro, Krypton, or whatever, we can take them and we can say, hey, you guys consolidate, you guys not consolidate. We don't have that world. So we need to think of, like, what is the counterfactual? What's the area that should have consolidated but didn't? And so the synthetic control method lets us do that. It lets us, by taking parts of similar areas that are facing the same kind of crisis, have the same demographics, have the same employment structure, same history, and we can create a fake city, or what's called a synthetic city, that looks very similar to the one that gets treated with consolidation. So this has been used in economics a lot. For example, it's been used to look at the case of Chavez in Venezuela. Was Chavez and his policies good or bad for growth? Well, we don't live in a world where Chavez didn't come to power in Venezuela. So we actually need to use the synthetic control method to say, well, can we use parts of Bolivia and other similar countries that are very oil reliant and see what happened to those countries that are similar to Venezuela but didn't have Chavez in his policies. Or something like Nebraska's unicameral legislature. It's very difficult to study the effects in the US of a unicameral legislature because we only have one state that has a unicameral legislature. So another problem that these types of studies have, and you should be wary of anything, is like if you're talking about economic development's like a really long run thing. It takes a while. So if you're saying we're going to look 5 years before consolidation, 5 years after, how many people actually moved in? How many employers moved in? How much savings was? We want a long period of time. And so we're going to limit ourselves to consolidations in a particular time period. We want a long period before consolidation. We want a long period after. And we're going to look at three outcomes that we might think of people have in their minds when they think of economic development. They think, hey, are incomes rising? Is the area getting wealthier, higher incomes per person? Is the area growing? For many people, for many areas, population decline is really the canary that says things aren't going well. And then finally, is employment going up? So we're going to look at these areas, and we're going to try to predict them. Because again, remember, we want to look at this. We want to create a synthetic, an area that doesn't consolidate. And so we want similar characteristics. So we think about a county. How would we say two counties are the same? Well, do they have the same age profile? Do they have the same racial demographics, same age? Do they have the same industrial mix, right? Are they very agriculture? We wouldn't want to compare Akron, Ohio, which is heavily industry, Goodyear, located there, with a very rural county. And then finally, is it very rural or very urban in a way that's not explained by that industrial concentration? So we're going to look at three cases. You have to case studies in these types of situations. We try to be systematic in our case studies because we want to look in this time frame. There's 5 major cases of city-county consolidation over this time period. 2 of them are the most massive counties in the area. And the synthetic control method's not appropriate. It can't find a good match. It'd be like needing to have a 1 million-person clinical trial. It'd be hard to do. So we look at Lafayette, City-Lafayette Parish, Louisiana, Athens-Clarke County, Georgia, and Augusta-Richmond County, Georgia. And I'm going to talk about these because the punchline of my research with my co-authors on this paper is the city-county consolidation really begs the question. Because all policymakers, if you are thinking this is a good idea, you're thinking like, I can snap my fingers and the policy gets implemented. And the real reason many city-county consolidations don't work is the political, the collective action problem of trying to get the city-county consolidation to happen in the first place. By coming to political consensus, in many cases, they enact policies that undermine. So you can think of it as like they're diluting the power of the treatment by the politics that goes on beforehand. And hopefully that'll become apparent as I talk through a little bit of the history. So just to give you an idea, this little green area right here, that's Lafayette Parish, Louisiana. South Central Louisiana, it's the second smallest parish in the state by land area. It is wealthier and more populous. It's a big petroleum area. So we want to make sure, again, that's where industrial mix matters a lot. It's now a regional technology and retail center. Unlike almost all other city-county consolidations, it was not the result of a financial crisis. It was a result of we're growing. We want to build new roads and infrastructure, and we can't get all these areas where the roads should connect to agree. And so let's bring everything, rather than create a transportation authority, let's consolidate, and then there won't be any of this fighting because it's all coming out of the same pot. And so the city council and the groups in favor of this got together, and they had broad support. The Chamber of Commerce, everybody basically got behind this. And 67% of city residents and 49% of residents living outside the city supported this referendum, the vote to consolidate. And so they had a successful referendum, and there was a 4-year transition period until it became operational. Okay, keep that in mind. Athens-Clarke County, Georgia. Okay, this is where University of Georgia is. It's the smallest of Georgia's 159 counties. It's also one of its most populous. Okay. At the time, real crisis, even though it had a university. I know this seems odd. I live in one of the most affluent counties in West Virginia, precisely because of the university. This was not the case in Athens County, Georgia. It was stable economic growth, but a lot of flight out to surrounding counties. So unlike the Lafayette case, here there were 4 failed consolidation referendums. So 4 separate times, city leaders said, hey, people are leaving the city and moving out to the county. We need to bring them back in by making the county part of the city. And 4 times, voters rejected that. So in order to earn support, enough support to pass a referendum, even though the reason for consolidation was to take advantage of economies of scale from a bigger county government, they guaranteed employees that no jobs would be lost because of city-county consolidation. And I don't have it up here, but they would harmonize salaries upward after consolidation. So remember, the point is achieve economies of scale. Maybe we need fewer spending on government services, and so therefore reduce our expenditures, and therefore require less taxes. And they guarantee no job loss, and hey, we're going to pay more. So from the very moment they start to get agreement, they have to, they undermine the very reason for consolidation. So it passes, and we'll see what happens. So it did pass. It passed 57.5% of city residents, 59% of unincorporated residents, and it immediately became operational in 1991. Okay, another Georgia case. If you don't know, Georgia, for some reason, had tons of attempts at consolidation from the 60s through the 80s. Okay, it's on the border of South Carolina. Major crisis. This is a major crisis example. White flight was a big issue. Okay, moving out of the city into the suburbs, shrinking tax base, everything you could think about why cities at that time would be in decline. Okay, so this is what political scientists who study this call this. This is definitely the crisis model of consolidation. I mean, the city was facing bankruptcy and major service cuts. Okay, and again, you see this over and over again. The consolidation was pursued in order to eliminate the duplication of services and improve quality. So, hey, city and county both have their own fire services. If we consolidate, we have only one fire service. But we have to cover more area. Again, it doesn't eliminate the job, maybe. It just kind of masks things. Again, like our other Georgia case, 4 failed referenda. Again, job protection and wage equalization. At the time, in this particular case, at the time of the referendum, the government employees in the unincorporated area were making 60 cents on the dollar as the city employees, and they got a 40% pay, well, actually not 40%, more like an 80% pay increase to harmonize. Not surprisingly, it passed with kind of wide support and happened consolidated the year after the referendum. Okay, now we get to graphics. So this is Lafayette County, and it's the fake Lafayette. And I don't see, how do I, is there a pointer on this? Okay, anyway, okay, I'll go back. The dotted line is the synthetic Louisiana. So we have up in the upper left we have per capita personal income. And you can see we don't have a perfect match there. It does seem to track, especially as we go into the referendum year of 1991. You see them in the 5 years leading up to it. They're very closely matched in per capita personal income. And then what happens afterwards? The dotted line is below the solid line. So the synthetic Louisiana Lafayette does worse than the consolidated. If we look in the second one, here on the right, which is population, we see a much closer match. And again, they're moving very closely leading up to consolidation in 1991, that red bar. And again, we see a divergence with the actual Lafayette doing much better than the synthetic in the 10 years afterwards. Here in total employment, again, it's less of a great match, although they do match right up in 1991. And again, we see this divergence between the synthetic and the actual. Now, you might say, well, maybe this isn't great. I'll talk about some of the other things we did to kind of be sure of the result. For me, I was talking to some students earlier today in a class, and I was saying one of the reasons I like being a social scientist is things that go against my priors. And my prior was, based on reading all the literature, was, well, I'm not going to find anything positive. Right? I've just been convinced by that this is going to be, and this thing for me is really robust. And which I was surprised. Again, it goes against my priors. But I also, after reading the history, I'm not surprised. Because the reasons were sound, and there were no efforts taken to ultimately undermine any sort of benefits that came from consolidation. One of the things you can do to be sure that's a real result, not perfect, is you could do what's called a placebo test. So a placebo test is basically you take any other county that you use to make up the fake one, and you assume that that one got consolidated. That's all those gray lines. So if you notice, all those gray lines almost entirely after the red bar are below the black line. That just says that if we assume that all these other places that didn't actually get consolidated were consolidated, they all do worse than the actual Lafayette. So the consolidation really seemed, I'm pretty sure that's a positive result. Lafayette did much better because of this consolidation. Clarke, Georgia, not so much. Okay? We have a much better fit if you look at per capita income or population or total employment. They're much tighter and much greater divergence. Here, the dotted line of the synthetic Clarke County, Georgia, is always above the actual. And in fact, if you look in per capita income, you can basically see that line for the real is flat. The rest of Georgia keeps on growing, or the synthetic Georgia keeps on growing. Same thing with employment grows, but synthetic grows much faster. Same thing with population. Now, Richmond, Georgia, in terms of per capita personal income, I'm skeptical of that synthetic on per capita personal income. You can see it's not very close. We don't do a good job of creating a synthetic Richmond, Georgia. But we do, there does seem a big divergence in terms of population and in terms of total employment. That divergence happens before the actual referendum. This could be because people knew this was happening. It could be because something else is going on. We do the placebo test. I'm not going to show them to you, but we do those, and we see the same thing, except now the gray mass is above the actual, meaning that all these other counties seem to do better than Richmond or synthetic Richmond. So, okay, what else can we do to be sure? Well, one, we can throw out areas that, if people are voting with their feet, if I'm liking what Louisiana Lafayette's doing and I'm moving into the area, well, that's going to harm nearby counties. So we can throw out nearby counties. We do that, our results hold up. for all of them. Another thing is maybe we still haven't dealt adequately with the fact that these areas are fundamentally different. Yes, we've tried to create a synthetic, but they still could be, we still could be fundamentally different than areas that are healthy. And our results are reflecting this. So we look at all the counties in Georgia. We can't do this for Lafayette because there's no other Louisiana consolidation attempts. But all the ones in Georgia that tried to have a referendum. So there was some sort of crisis. They wanted, and if they ultimately never passed it, we used that as to create our synthetic. So they tried and failed to pass, and we get the exact same result. So in some ways, for many people, certainly referees at journals and other places I've given, like people who have read this literature, it's very unsatisfying. People like clear answers. And I think there's a clear answer, but the clear answer is not to just say city-county consolidation is good or whatever. It's like, what do you have to do in order to have it pass politically? Policy changes are not snapping your fingers, right? Unless you're in an autocracy. In a democracy, people have to, at least a majority agree on that. And the changes that happen to these consolidation charters that eventually lead them to get passed are the same thing that undermine the very reason why the proponents were arguing they should be done. And so, yeah, at least that's my takeaway from the Louisiana case is everybody said, yes, this seems like an obvious thing to do. We need this new infrastructure. Our current structure of local government is a bad idea, and that's why it kind of overwhelmingly passed. And that's why they were successful. In Georgia, people said, this isn't going to work. You're not fixing the underlying problem. We kind of buy enough votes, and it passes. And surprisingly, the act of like getting people to agree to it undermines the very reason that you're trying to consolidate. And so for me, the lesson to be taken away from policy entrepreneurs is sometimes, like, you get so focused on the actual deal that you forget in what it takes to get the deal passed. You're undermining your very chance for success. I think this is a very human thing. I know as a department chair, I often feel myself making those types of decisions. And so this is a very odd question, but I think a very answer, but very Ostromian answer is ultimately it matters how individual areas come to a consensus on what the appropriate thing to do is. And this might not make people feel comfortable, right? Because if Athens, City-Clarke, City, Georgia, clearly there were issues that city was struggling with. And people often feel, well, something has to be done, and this is something. But at least based on our synthetic control, something was actually worse than not doing anything at all. And maybe it's the social scientist version of a Hippocratic oath, but first I think you should do no harm and be very humble and make every attempt that you're not undermining your chances for success if you're trying to engage in these types of kind of policy entrepreneurship. I have one more slide. Yes, so I already said this. Just don't undermine your chance for success in your attempts to get this thing passed collectively. And so that's everything, and I think we'll have plenty of time for questions. Thank you.
So if you're a little bit shy to talk on the microphone, don't forget that you can put in a question via Twitter, hashtag capitalism and society. If we have some questions, we do have the catch box. I'm really looking forward to throwing this thing. So here it comes. Oh, yeah.
All right, is this thing on? Ah, it works.
Yeah.
Did your research tease out any factors that you think might be a factor for success for these jurisdictions that feel that they have to consolidate? Is there another path that should be considered, or were you mostly just questioning whether it was a good idea or not?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. We started off was just like, well, let's see what the data say. And then when we got the Lafayette example, it was like, what's going on here? Let's go read very deeply. I mean, I guess I'm an odd economists tend to like, let's get lots of data and look, 10,000 feet down. And I like to use that to really get into the details. And so that's where we found that there's a very different experience. I don't know enough. What we weren't able to find is in the Georgia cases was ultimately it intractable. What I mean by intractable is like, was there no way for them to get some sort of consensus in a way to have a referendum passed that didn't undermine the economic benefits? It's easy to look at this and look at Lafayette and say, well, they did it right. I mean, they really spent years laying the groundwork for the referendum and convincing people that this was the next stage. All city officials in the chamber spoke with one voice. And that clearly didn't happen from my reading of the Georgia cases. But it's unclear to me that in a world where they even did that they still would have done it without some sort of wage equalization job. I think it's a really difficult thing to kind of think in that counterfactual world. I do think there is something to really carefully trying to build consensus ahead of time.
So one thing when I always think of more centralization is the loss of accountability that you get with the decentralized government system. And so I'm curious if you or anyone else has looked at factors that might weed out some of this accountability problem that you might see, maybe like whether it would be maybe the distribution of like where politicians live after consolidation or bills introduced and adopted, something like that.
Wow. Okay, let me see if this answers the question, because it's a great question. And the first thing that comes to mind, maybe this doesn't answer the question, but okay, so I'm from Cleveland. I grew up in an area called Cleveland Heights. And Cleveland is odd. Like a lot of my early research was on overlapping or non-overlapping cities. So like I mentioned earlier, fiscal federalism. Fiscal federalism is the idea that some levels of governments do different things. But we have lots of governments that are on the same level and interact with each other. You can think about, like, with West Virginia, we have library districts and school districts. They often work together on school programs. And you can think if their borders match up, there's better communication between them, the coverage area. One of the best school districts in Cleveland, one of the best school districts in the Cleveland area is the Shaker Heights School District. Well, a very small part of it, about 4 blocks, is in the city of Cleveland. If you're a politician in the city of Cleveland, you have to live in the city of Cleveland. So where do they live? Well, if they have kids, they live in the part of the city of Cleveland that's in the suburban school district. And so your question got me thinking, like, in terms of accountability. I actually think they don't have a ton of accountability because that was kind of their safety valve. They could afford to kind of not have to experience all the issues related to necessarily the Cleveland City schools, because like I can live in the city, but I send my kids to a suburban school district. But I do think there's less accountability the larger you get. There's been a lot of work on what economists call capitalization. You can think about government quality. How much would you be willing to pay for a house in an area that gave you really good government services at a fraction of the price of their neighbors? You'd be willing to pay more for a house. And so we can estimate how much more people are willing to pay for good services. Well, it turns out that studies on that capitalization say the larger an area is, good stuff doesn't get capitalized. It gets diffused. Because you can't guarantee, like you told me, hey, if we increase our taxes by this much, we're going to rebuild schools. Well, Cleveland has 63 elementary schools. Which elementary school are you going to rebuild? Is it going to be the one in my neighborhood? Oh, no, not for 40 years. But if you lived where I did, we had 3 elementary schools. Oh, am I going to pay for more taxes? I'm pretty sure I'm going to get some benefit, even if it's not my school. It might be the middle school. It might be the high school. So small has its problems, but it tends to be more accountable because it's easy to follow where spending goes. And to link your decision to be in favor of it to the actual benefit. Yes?
In your study, you used the synthetic control to compare the performance of the city-county consolidation. Right?
Yes.
Why did you not compare the city-county consolidation's data on economic development to the actual city and county economic development data from before the consolidation, instead of using the synthetic control method?
So you mean just like a traditional time series where I think because we're not getting at what's the counterfactual. Like all these areas, I think part of the reason with all the literature is the areas that consolidate are different than the areas that don't consolidate. And hopefully the synthetic control method gets them closer to the areas that didn't consolidate, give us that counterfactual. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but you have a direct answer by looking at the city and the county and their time series data before and after consolidation, right? You have the city with its economic development data, you have the county with its economic development data, then you have the consolidation, then you have the economic development data.
But let's say I found that consolidated area did worse than the two of them separate. Let's say there were two. There's actually many governments. But let's say I did the consolidated versus the two governments beforehand. I might find that they declined, right? But that doesn't tell me they might have already been on a decline, and the consolidation. I don't know whether the consolidation actually did that or not. I know they did that. It's like someone with cancer giving them chemotherapy. I can't look at the outcome necessarily and say, I have to compare it to something else. And there's not enough consolidated areas to, unlike in a cancer trial where you look at all outcomes. I can't compare it. Does that make sense? We can maybe talk afterwards. It's kind of getting in the weeds.
So you're talking about the city plus county consolidations.
Yes.
Does that make it into a purely city district then, into that area? Like the entirety of the county? Does that then become an entire city?
It's actually a combined city. It's usually called a city-county government. Or
Okay.
like in Indianapolis, it's called Unigov, one government would be yeah.
Okay, and then a second question to that too. Did you ever do one that was a county and county consolidation or a city and city consolidation?
I don't know. I did not. I don't actually know. The only time I've ever heard of any county consolidation arguments is in West Virginia, and it hasn't happened. But I'd love to know if there were other county consolidations. To me, the argument for county consolidation in West Virginia is a really dumb argument. The argument is based on, well, we have no large cities, and if we consolidate, it'll be viewed like a large city, and we'll get more development because people will think of the Charleston that as being a bigger area. We're just kind of like confusing people. Like somehow changing its name is going to make people think it's a bigger thing. Maybe that's right. I don't know. But
And then on the city one, in Minneapolis, for example, Minneapolis and the Minneapolis-St. Paul area that's kind of what I was thinking for the city-city consolidation. I don't know if they did, but they call it the Twin Cities now. So
Yeah, I don't know enough about the details of that. I think the literature on that is much more positive, that where you agree there's some sort of commonality or some sort of need. So a lot of local governments have agreements like we'll work together on this particular issue, right? We'll have a shared school district, or we'll have a shared fire department. But these other things we want to keep separate because we want autonomy and kind of local control. And I think that's much more positive because there's a specific purpose you're doing it for. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
So, real quick clarification question from Twitter. What's the unit of analysis?
Oh, great question.
Counties?
It's the counties. It's the counties. So we take all we just think of the whole area that's being treated, the whole county that's being treated. So anything in the county as before and after.
Another Twitter question. Does the percent of the population who work in the private and public sector affect whether consolidation helps or hurts?
Wow, were you referee number 2? That was actually a question we had going through the kind of journal refereeing process, and we did our best to dig in and get that data, and we could not find enough historical data to get. I think that's a fascinating question, but I'm sorry, I can't answer it.
Okay. I have a question. This is a really interesting study, and you did a very good job on it. But essentially, I think your results are saying that the way that consolidation takes place is what matters. I mean, what you do. So, I mean, when you showed like how the consolidation happened before you showed the results, to me, it's not surprising what actually happened. But I still think. I mean, would you agree that there's still more research to be done on knowing, does consolidation really help? I mean, because even if you had the same exact consolidation procedures in the Georgia counties, we still don't know, would that have been beneficial or not? I mean, obviously, it makes sense that it wasn't beneficial just because of the way that they said the jobs are guaranteed and all those things. But I mean, we have one observation saying that if you do it the right way, it works. I mean, so I mean, it's not a criticism.
No, I think you're 100% right. I mean, this is also pushing back on economists, I think, in thinking of that when we treat things, we say this was a city-county consolidation, and so when we make when we're doing a drug trial, everybody who gets the actual drug is getting the same drug. Not all city-county consolidations are equal. They're very different formulations, and so I view this paper as partly pushing back on that idea that like no, each one is a product of and maybe that's unsatisfying because everybody in local economic development is looking for a silver bullet, and things are not that easy, and so. Maybe it's just me as an economist raining on people's parades, but I do think that that's what I take out of it, is it is possible. So I don't want to be Mr. Doom all the time, but how it's done is really, really important.
Yeah, and very important, I agree with you.
Yeah. No, so I think while he's passing the box, I'll just say that I think the really interesting question that I wish I could snap my fingers to know the answer to is, if I could have snapped my fingers and had Georgia consolidate and not had everything that went in, just saying you're one Unigov, would that have performed better? That to me is really the interesting question that I don't know how we could test that.
I have kind of a two-part question. I don't know if you can answer the first part, but I haven't heard about this very much. Are you aware of whether consolidation attempts, regardless of success, have increased in like the last 20 or 30 years, decreased? And then my second question is, do you think like over the next 20 to 30 years there'll be more consolidation attempts or no?
I think great question. There's waves. So you see very distinct waves at periods of time. So there were waves in the 20s and 30s, you can imagine, both because of the progressive movement, but also because of the Great Depression. There were waves, setting aside school district waves. School district waves are very different, but city government, county government waves in the 60s and 70s. And then we had another wave after the Great Recession. So clearly, like, kind of business cycle plays a very large role in this. When times become tight, like trying to cut fat, and people see two people with the same title or same function as being fat. The school district consolidation is a very different animal. That was primarily driven by changing educational technology and the decline of the one-room at one schoolhouse.
Hi. You mentioned that the trend seemed to be towards consolidation. Are there many cases where it's like government's breaking apart more? And if so, would a study on those like broken apart governments, would that add useful information?
Great question. I actually think I love anything where you can look at the same problem from two ways. I don't know of any cases where we've seen that. If anybody knows of any, I'd love to hear it. But I know of one case where a school district, the problem we see, there's a big puzzle in the literature why we don't see, like let's just give this example. If the optimal size of a school district to have everything you would think a school should have, right? Enough people to have AP Calc, for example, is, let's just say 4,000 students. Why then do we not break up there's one outside Columbus, Ohio, that's 15,000 students. And it was 1,000 20 years ago. So it's growing. There's a big rural school district that became a bedroom community, and then nothing broke off because there's a really political problem, is how do you break it off where some people don't feel like they're being harmed in that, and so it's kind of status quo reigns. It's easier to bring together than it is to break up, and then especially once you think about I think an important legacy of the 60s in a lot of states is a lot of states don't allow that with schools because of issues related to white flight and desegregation. So they have outright bans. Ohio has a ban. As long as there's any demographic differences between the areas, you can't break up. And so the one that did was identical. And so it met that standard, but otherwise you can't.
I was just wondering, like, with the Great Depression, Great Recession, and with past issues of like funding and bonds for local governments, if you looked a lot into the role of bonds playing into the politics of consolidation. And maybe even if that's accounted for in that model that you used.
What do you mean? Can you clarify by bonds?
Like funding for local schools and stuff like that, and just general bond issues. As I know they can be pretty contentious in local government referenda.
Yeah, that's a good question. We didn't look at it in these cases. I know it's each of these states. We got a lot of pushback. People want us to not just look within the states for comparison counties and things. And one of the reasons I wanted to only look at the comparison counties within state is each state has its own referendum rules. Each state has its own financing structure. So I don't know enough about that to answer if that was the constraint. It doesn't seem to me, at least based on my knowledge of Ohio, to have been a constraint. Really, it's an erosion of the tax base through the decline in property values from the demand to live in the place. Because what happens if you think of like just basic supply and demand, if people are moving out, less demand for the same housing isn't going anywhere. So housing prices are going to fall. As soon as reassessment happens, property taxes are going to fall. And so areas that fund schools and government by property taxes are going to lose revenue. And that's really leading to the crisis. That's the Athens, kind of Clarke County, Georgia. So it's not like so much new tax failure, new bond issues. It's kind of just the regular reassessment.
So thank you all for being a great audience. And please don't forget to turn in your cards and surveys on your way out. Join us for pizza outside in the foyer.
Thank you.